Okay, great. So to those who are listening to the recording, I'm sorry I forgot to record the beginning, which was all about Jewish history and why we have a connection to the land of Israel. And the place we're at now is the 1800s, the late 1800s. There started to be this viewpoint of what we call modern Zionism, modern political Zionism, that, what would it look like to actually create a Jewish state in that land today? And people started to move there. So moving there was called aliyah, making aliyah. The word aliyah means to go up. So we say the same word when somebody is called to the Torah. To read the Torah is you have an aliyah. You're called as an aliyah LeTorah, to the Torah. But we use the same word about moving to Israel. It's an aliyah. You make aliyah to Israel. There were what are called waves of aliyah, meaning waves of people who decided to move to Israel starting in the 1800s. And if your Israel 102 class might go into the different waves and when they happened and where people came from. But there were waves of aliyah. And so bit by bit, Jews came from different parts of the world, but particularly at that point from Europe, to come to the land of Israel and start to make a home there. And sort of the seeds of trying to put together what might someday be a Jewish state. That process was decades in the making. Eventually, of course, we get to World War I and eventually to World War II. In World War II, of course, we have the Holocaust. Millions of Jews were killed. And at that point, there were already many Jews who lived in the land of Israel. There had been a couple of waves of aliyah, of people moving to Israel prior to that. There's a lot of history of what was happening in Israel prior to World War II. But at that point, there became the viewpoint more globally that we do need a place for Jews to go, because Jews were not really welcomed in many, many parts of the world. Even in the United States, some of you might know that during World War II, Jews were turned away from the United States as well, in terms of being refugees. So the question was, where are Jews going to go? Because they're not welcome all these other places. And this viewpoint that Jews need a homeland, a place they can go, took on more acceptance throughout the world. And so the United Nations came up with a plan to create a state of Israel that would be a Jewish state. So that gets us all the way to now getting to our maps. So let me pull up the maps that I want to show you. Hold on 1 minute. Before I pull up a map, I do want to say that in the 1800s, late 1800s and early 1900s, this was a time of European powers were, colonial powers were taking over lots of parts of the world and kind of dividing up the world, saying, okay, Britain, you're in charge of this land, and France, you're in charge of this land. And that's exactly what happened in the Middle East. So I believe that I have a map to show you of how that looked in the Middle East. Let me pull this up. Can you all see my screen? Hopefully. So you'll see here on this map, and let me scroll down a bit, that everything that is shaded was territories that were administered by France. What is in the white color is territories administered by Britain. And then the ones with the diagonal line is territories that were protected by Britain. So not really administered by, but Britain was sort of in control over to some degree, protecting those. So this was an agreement in 1920. What you can see here is what is today Israel was also part of a land connected to Jordan. All of that was one area called Palestine, and it was controlled by the British, along with Iraq and other areas as well. You can see Syria and Lebanon, modern day Syria and Lebanon were French, which is why French is even a language spoken there to this day. And you can see, anyway, you can get a sense of the map. So that is what Israel looked like before World War II. Britain was in charge of the land. I have a different map to show you also, just a little bit closer up. Hold on. And I'm sorry, I can't get rid of the stuff on the side here of this website. But you can see here, this is called British Mandate Palestine. What that means is that the British had a mandate. They were kind of in charge. They were administering this land. I don't know that you'd call it a country per se. The term country wasn't really used, but the British mandate meant that the Britons were in charge, or the British were in charge of all of this land. At a certain point, the British actually decided to lop off that side section, and it eventually became what is modern day Jordan. So by the time of World War II, there was a question of what to do with. Oh, you know what? I'm going to pull that up again because I want to show you the Jordan River and where that falls. Hold on a second. Let me pull up that map. So you can see a river that cuts down the middle of this orange space. That is the Jordan River. So you can see that there's the Jordan River up here. It connects what's up here, this little, what looks like a small body of water is called the Kinneret in Hebrew. It's the Sea of Galilee. And then there's a river, and then it goes down to the Dead Sea. And then the river goes all the way down to the Red Sea, which is down by where it says Egypt. So that river is what eventually divided Jordan from, we'll call it Palestine, the rest of where the British were in charge. So Jordan is separate, and then we have this land. So now we get to World War II, and at the end of World War II, there's this feeling amongst leaders throughout the world that, you know what, there were two issues. One is we need to figure out what to do with Jews and how we can have a Jewish country. The other major issue was that there was a lot of fighting between Jews and Arabs in the British Mandate Palestine, in that land, sort of for control, because there was a question of who's in charge, and neither one wanted the British, but there was a lot of fighting around who would control the land. And so the UN got involved, the United Nations got involved, and came up with a partition plan for the land. So I'm going to show you now what the partition plan was, meaning the UN, the United Nations, the leaders from the UN sat down together and said, let's divide up the land, based in part on kind of where Jews and Arabs live and how we can kind of make it work. So here's the plan they came up with. Again, you can ignore the sidebar. Sorry about that. So UN partition plan for Palestine. So they said, you can see that the Jewish state would be the light color and the Arab state would be the darker color there. And then Jerusalem would have an international, it would have international control. It would be neither Arab nor Jewish. And that's because both wanted it. And so it was sort of agreed upon that it would be controlled by an international body. So the UN made this plan and presented it to the Jewish leadership at the time and the Arab leadership at the time. And the Jewish leadership at the time said, great, thank you, we'd love a state. And the Arab leadership at the time said, no, we don't agree to this plan. We don't think it's fair. It's unclear exactly. They wanted more land or all the land, did not agree to this plan. But it was voted into existence, and I don't know if anyone on this call was alive at that time, or I should say alive and remembers. You might have been young in 1947, but people who are alive and remember that time, many Jews have a very evocative, emotional memory of that night when the partition plan was voted into existence, because they literally went around to every country represented at the UN to vote yes or no on this plan. And when all the yeses started coming in, Jews around the world celebrated. This was finally worldwide recognition that Jews could have their own land. So it was a huge celebration in the Jewish world the night of the UN partition plan. Jews said, great, yes, we're ready, we want to have a country. And the Arab leadership at the time rejected it. So the Jewish leadership said, well, we're going to declare a state. Like, it's been approved, or I don't know what the right word is, proposed by the UN. It's been accepted by all these international bodies. We're ready to have a state. And Israel declared its independence in 1948, in May of 1948. So on the day of the Declaration of Independence, the Arab countries that surrounded Israel declared war. So what was seen as the independence for Israel was seen as a tragedy by the Arab people who were living there, because they didn't want this plan, they didn't accept this plan. So literally the night of independence became the beginning of a war. Jewish Israelis call it the War of Independence. Arabs in the land, and I've been using the term Arab intentionally because the term Palestinian is a little bit of a later term, but Arabs who lived in the land call that the Nakba, the destruction. So the same event was viewed very differently by the different populations. So that war happened, and you could say Israel won the war in the sense that Israel became a state. And Israel's borders after the war were, I'm going to show you actually, let me pull up my screen, were actually a little bit more than what the UN had said. So this is the UN partition plan. So you get a good look at it. I'm sorry I don't have it side by side, but I'm going to scroll down. And now you can see what it looked like after 1949 when the war was over. So I'm going to go back up. You can kind of compare what happened. So Israel essentially won a little bit more land than what was allocated to them by the UN. In 1949, at the end of that war, again, Jewish Israelis call it the War of Independence. At the end of the War of Independence, these were the lines that were drawn about where the state of Israel would be. So this light tan color is now the state of Israel and the beginning of the state of Israel. Gaza, the Gaza Strip, which is here in orange, was controlled by Egypt. And what became known as the West Bank was controlled by Jordan. The West Bank is called the West Bank because it is west of the Jordan River. It is the West Bank of the Jordan River. So sometimes that's confusing for Jews looking at a map of Israel because it's actually on the eastern side of Israel, but it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. So that was all controlled by Jordan, and Jerusalem became a divided city. There was East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem. West Jerusalem, meaning closer to the Mediterranean Sea, was controlled by Israel, and East Jerusalem was controlled by Jordan. The old city of Jerusalem, where some of us have been before, the Western Wall, everything in the old city was controlled by Jordan, and Jews were not allowed to enter. And in fact, the line where the division between Jordan and Israel was outside the city just a little bit, and it's right where today the school is where I went to rabbinical school, is right on that line. It was on the border. It didn't exist at that time. So prior to 1948, Jews could go to the Old City and Jews could go to the Western Wall. Remember, it was all controlled by the British. After 1948 and this war, Jews lost access to the Old City and to the Western Wall, but gained a country. So now Israel is a country and has those borders. So Israel begins as a country, 1948, going along. Then we get to 1967. And again, because this is basic Israel in an hour, I'm not going to go through all the details. But in 1967, Israel's intelligence gets word that all the Arab countries around it are going to declare war on Israel. Like, they don't want Israel to be here. They don't want a Jewish state here. They're, supporting the Arabs who live in that land. Let me back up and say that at the time that Israel declared its independence, and I'll share the screen again just so you can see it. So you can see this. Any Arab who lived in Israel proper, meaning the light tan color here, was offered citizenship. So there are Arabs who are Israeli citizens. In fact, about 20% of Israel's citizens are Arab, and they are usually called Arab Israelis. That's kind of the term that was used. If they were an Arab person who lived not in this area, then in theory, you would have thought maybe they would become Jordanian or Egyptian citizens, but that did not happen. Jordan did not extend citizenship, and neither did Egypt. So the people in the West Bank and Gaza became what later became known as Palestinians. Arab people who live in the land of Palestine, who are kind of stateless, were not really welcomed very much into Jordan, nor into Egypt, and of course not Israel. They weren't in Israel proper either. So that is one of the seeds of the problems that we see today. Is this going all the way back to the founding of the state of Israel, is that the Arabs who lived there, kind of what became of them? Did they become citizens of Israel or anywhere else? Another thing to note is that if you go back to this map of the partition plan, this was based loosely on where people lived, kind of where there were Jewish centers and Arab centers, but there was also mixing. And in the war, perhaps not surprisingly, there was a lot of movement of peoples. And some of that was kicking out and some of it was fleeing. in both directions. So Jews that had lived in the West Bank fled or were kicked out of many of those regions. Arabs who lived in some of the places that became Israel were either kicked out or fled the places that became the state of Israel. Those people who fled and left their homes became refugees. Like they left because of war. So they became refugees. There were, of course, some, we'll call them Jewish refugees from previous places that they had been living, but they were accepted into the state of Israel. The Palestinian refugees didn't have anywhere to go, really. Jordan set up some refugee camps, but they basically became refugees in Jordan. There were refugees and Palestinian refugees went to all the surrounding Arab countries and basically became refugees there and were not really fully absorbed by those countries. So the Palestinian problem, so to speak, began right at the beginning of the state of Israel. Yichen is asking, why didn't the Palestinian accept Israel's citizen offer? So the Arabs who lived in Israel proper largely did. It was the Palestinians the Arabs who did not live in the borders of this new state of Israel, who lived in the West Bank or Gaza or in these other countries. They didn't have the offer of Israeli citizenship. They didn't live in Israel, but they also were not offered citizenship in those other countries, at least at that time. So the refugee problem became a major, it is still to this day, a major issue around Israeli and Palestinian conflict and negotiations is what happens to all those refugees, even from back in 1948. Because, of course, those people have had children and grandchildren, and there's generations of refugees now. So we get to 1967. And in 1967, all of the countries surrounding Israel decided to declare war on Israel, and the Israeli intelligence heard about it in advance and called up all of their troops. In Israel, they have an obligatory military service. Everyone has to serve. And so they called up, huge numbers of their population to come back as like reserve troops to defend Israel. And in defending Israel, many of you were alive in 1967. You might remember this in the news. In trying to defend Israel, what ended up happening was that by that point, Israel had a really, really strong military and not only held their own in terms of the defense, but captured a ton of land. Actually captured 7 times more land than Israel was to start with. So I'll show you what that. So it's a major military victory for Israel and shocking to the whole world, and frankly, shocking to Israel too. So in this, hopefully you can see now in this map, after the 1967 war, which by the way is also known as the 6-Day War, because it was only 6 days and Israel captured all this land. And then an armistice was declared. So it was Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt all declared war. And this is what happened. Israel gained all this land. So the light color is what was the state of Israel prior to 67. And this darker orangey color is what was captured in the war. It is a lot of land. And in a typical military battle, when 2 countries fight and one country captures land, very often you annex it. You say, okay, this is now our land. We got it. It's ours. It's our country. Now this belongs to us. But that didn't happen with Israel. Israel did not annex all of this land right away. The question of whether that land would become permanently part of Israel was a question, and a question that did not get resolved when the war was declared over. It was sort of a temporary borders were drawn to say, okay, we're not sure what we're going to do about this land. Israel eventually, and from what I understand, and there's many narratives, so I'm trying to be as factual as possible and as unbiased as possible, but of course I am biased. I am Jewish. I am a rabbi. But from what I understand, part of the problem was that even if Israel had said, you know what, never mind, we're going to give the West Bank back to Jordan, Jordan didn't want it. Jordan also didn't really annex it originally. Jordan was controlling it. But remember, they didn't make the Palestinians, the Arabs living in that land, their citizens. And they didn't really want the land back. Likewise with Gaza, Egypt didn't really want Gaza. So in a way, now Israel controls all of this land, and there's a question of what to do with it. The borders that were declared after, or the line that was drawn at this point in 1967 is what's called the Green Line. And actually, I'm going to go back. The Green Line comes from back here, I believe, in 1949. But it was kind of reinforced after 67, which was that the border that had existed in 1949 is now no longer a border in the same way. Israel controls all the land, but it's not fully annexed. Israel didn't say, okay, now this is officially all our country, because of the issue of all these millions of Palestinians who don't want to be Israeli citizens. Also, there's issues that all the countries surrounding them are, at war. And so there was the hope that there's sort of land for peace deals, like we'll give some of this land if you make peace with us as a country. And so the Green Line, you might have heard the term Green Line, is referring to these borders. I don't know if you can you see my mouse if I have my mouse on the screen? So the Green Line are these borders here that differentiate what was Israel before the 67 war and the parts that wasn't, and that Israel then captured after the 67 war. And so sometimes people talk about whether you're going to cross the Green Line or not. That's what it's talking about. There's no actual green line like on the earth. But on maps, a green line was used to differentiate these different borders. So Israel captured all this land. And then when Israel tried to annex some of it, because they didn't annex all of it, but for example, the Golan Heights up here, Israel captured from Syria, is very strategic because it's up high. It's for military purposes a really important piece of land to control. International bodies did not recognize the annexation. That's also true of East Jerusalem. After 67, Israel captured the old city of Jerusalem as well as all of East Jerusalem and annexed it. Israel viewed it as the reunification of Jerusalem. Instead of being a divided city, it's now reunified altogether. And that was also not recognized by international bodies at the time. So now we'll go down to in 1982. So this is quite a while later. Remember, this was 67. Israel also captured all of the Sinai Desert, by the way, in 67. We haven't talked about that too much, and you'll see why. In 1982, Israel made peace with Egypt, which was huge. I mean, Israel had been, in a non-peaceful relationship with all of the Arab countries surrounding it. And in 1982, there was a landmark peace treaty. It was a huge deal. And the way that the treaty worked was that Egypt would recognize Israel as a state, which these Arab countries had never recognized Israel as a state, and make peace, meaning have normalized relations. People could travel between Israel and Egypt. Diplomats would work together, a peaceful relationship if Israel gave back Sinai. So Israel gave back Sinai, no longer belongs to Israel anymore, and peace was made. That was huge. My understanding is that Gaza was offered also, but Egypt didn't want it. We could talk another time in a 102 class about why that was the case. But this was a huge deal because Egypt was the first Arab country to recognize the Jewish state, and the border was set, and Israel withdrew all of its forces and its people from Sinai in 1982. We will move on to today. Well, this isn't today exactly. But the map that you see here after 1982 in some ways reflects the map that we have today. What has happened, there's a few differences. The Golan Heights, which is up here in kind of this lighter or a little bit darker brown color, Israel has annexed. Israel views it as part of Israel proper. Israel does not ever intend to give it to anybody else. Israel does not really see it as on the negotiating table in any kind of negotiated settlement in the future with Palestinians. Again, for very strategic reasons. Syria, when Israel didn't control this land, the Syrian forces were often kind of firing on Israelis down below. It was very dangerous for Israel not to control this land. It's also, there's lots of wineries. It's beautiful. It's good for agriculture. Most of you who have been to Israel have probably been to the Golan Heights. It's also not today considered to be particularly dangerous. Like there's not a lot of violence that's happening there. Also, I would say in contemporary times, the Syria has been very volatile just internally. There's been a lot of problems in Syria, war in Syria. And so all the more so Israel does not want to give up this strategic place that kind of where they border Syria, they have the heights, the physical heights. So the Golan Heights, Israel views as annexed and done. That's part of Israel. And in most maps you see today of Israel, you won't see any borders drawn there. That's considered part of Israel. Where it gets really tricky is the West Bank and Gaza. The West Bank, well, I'll start with Gaza. Israel controlled Gaza up until 2000, I'm going to get the year wrong. I think it was 8 or 9, or 2007. And I'll look it up to get the exact date. But Israel withdrew from Gaza unilaterally. So over time, there have been many attempts at peace treaties between Israel and the Palestinians that live in these lands, that want to have a Palestinian state. And all of those peace talks have failed. There's been different attempts with different leaders and different strategies. But the idea of all of it was that Israel would give this land as part of a settled agreement, a negotiated two-party agreement. But Gaza is really almost exclusively Arab. There were Jewish settlers living there, but very few. There were a few thousand Jewish settlers and way, way, way more Arabs, Palestinians that lived in Gaza. Gaza is its own story. It's a very sad story of what's happened in Gaza. But Gaza is very, very crowded. There's very impoverished, terrible infrastructure. It's just a really difficult place. And it has been a breeding place for terrorists, for some of the Palestinians living there. Hamas in particular has been just stockpiling weapons and rockets and building tunnels to basically just fire at Israel and to try to kill as many Israelis as possible. And so at a certain point, Israel decided that by continuing to control that land, it was doing more harm than good. It was just feeding into the narrative of, the occupation, that Israel's occupying us. And there were very few Jews living there. And so, but there were a couple thousand. So Israel made a unilateral decision to pull out of Gaza and to say, okay, we're out. It's Palestinians, it's yours. It's your land. You can have elections, you can vote, you can be in charge. We are done with this land. And not only are we done, we're going to forcibly remove the Jews who refuse to leave. To say, you Jewish settlers are making it worse. You're, insisting on living there. Israel are going to remove you. It's a very painful process for Israel. It was an internal conflict of trying to, sort of Jew against Jew to try to get some of those settlers to move. But Israel did it. The military pulled out. The hope was that by unilaterally withdrawing, it would lead to a more peaceful situation, even though it wasn't a negotiated peace. That has partially helped, but as you heard in the news this past year, there was a major crisis with Gaza this past year. So this isn't the time or space to get into the details of that. But Israel is not in control of Gaza right now. Israel does control some of the borders, and there are some ways that both the international community and Israel have imposed certain kind of restrictions on Gaza for security reasons. But Israel is not there as the government inside Gaza. Gazans did have one election where they elected Hamas to power over the Palestinian Authority, which is a different leadership of Palestinians. And it was, but there was only one election, and since then there has been no election. It's been over 10 years since there's been an election in Gaza. That's the situation with Gaza. The West Bank is a whole completely different story than Gaza. I'm going to pull up the map one more time. The West Bank, this is the deep irony, is that the West Bank is where the majority of the Arab population lives, but it also is the location of our Jewish sacred spaces. Most of the biblical texts that talk about the land of Israel refer to cities that are actually in the West Bank. You know what? I have a different map that can, I think, show this. Let me see if I can find it easily and quickly. But the cities that are in the West Bank are some of the cities that you hear about in the biblical text. You hear about Jericho, and you hear about Hebron, and you hear about Beersheba. Not Beersheba, I'm sorry. Bethlehem. Well, that's in the Christian Bible. But Beersheba is right, kind of on the border there. But the sites where our matriarchs and patriarchs were are largely in the West Bank. So it's a more emotional conversation for Israel about how much to release control of that land, because Jews feel very tied to that land from our narrative and from our history. There are also a lot of Jewish settlers in the West Bank. Some of them are there for religious reasons. A lot of them are there for economic reasons, because when Israel captured that land after 1967, for a variety of reasons, they encouraged Jews to settle there. And so the land was very cheap. Some of it was land that was, not occupied by anybody. Some of it was previously Arab lands that were captured in the war. So that land was cheap. So for some people, I would say many Israelis moved there because it was a lot cheaper than living in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or something like that. So there are now a lot of Jews that do live there. So another problem as part of the contemporary Israel situation is what to do about the Jewish settlers that live in the West Bank. There were not very many in Gaza, so when Israel pulled out of Gaza, they forcibly removed them. But it would be a major, major issue to try to remove all the Jewish settlers from the land of the West Bank right now. So that more or less gets us to today. And just in terms of the land of Israel, the different places, why it's very, very complicated. Some of you asked some questions that were related more about kind of relating to Israel. How do we relate to Israel? How do we connect to Israel? How do we maybe show support for Israel? I would say there are many answers to that question. The biggest one, I think, for us as American Jews is to do what you're all doing today, which is to learn. The more that we learn and understand, the better we can be partners and support and try to make our voices heard in positive ways. I think that it's very easy as Americans to see things in kind of black and white. And that's true whether it's these black and white, like people are pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, or they're, they say Israel is an apartheid state. Well, it's a very black and white way of looking at things. The situation in Israel is very complex, and it has been since the beginning. Since the time that the British were there, it was very complex. And then even from the day that Israel declared independence, it's been a really complicated and nuanced situation. It's not all right or all wrong. So I think education is the number one thing. Before we end today, I'm going to share some other educational things that you can do through our congregation and otherwise. But I would say education in general is a great way to connect and to learn and to also show support. It's hard to show support if you don't exactly know what you're supporting. We didn't talk at all in the last hour about the complexity within the state of Israel. I was talking more about just its borders and the map and where is Israel and where is, these other territories. But within Israel itself, it's also very, very complicated. There are really significant tensions between people who are more religious and more secular, even within the Jewish part of Israel. The ultra-Orthodox are a pretty high percentage there, much more so than, for example, in the United States, and have a lot of political power. And that has led to some really big challenges around what does it even mean to have a Jewish state, and what's the Jewish character of the state. So that's another realm of complexity to kind of learn about. So when we say we want to support Israel, like what does that look like and what does that mean, and what kind of Israel do we want to support is a question. Somebody asked earlier, I heard that in Israel, the annual salaries are very low. Somebody said $30,000 a year, $30,000 US dollars a year. I don't know the exact numbers, but economics are definitely challenging in Israel. There's a pretty wide gap of the rich and poor, just like in the United States, and there are definitely some economic challenges. There are some really significant environmental challenges in Israel, just like here in California with droughts and issues around water, but it's overlaid by this complexity of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because the water sources are on the borders. So the Jordan River, for example, is a major source of water, and it's on the border between Israel and Jordan. Israel did, by the way, make peace with Jordan a number of years ago, but Israel has not made peace with some of the other Arab countries. What that means in a practical sense is that for a time, if you had gone to Israel and Israel was stamped on your passport, you would not be allowed to go into other countries. Like you couldn't go to Syria, for example. But you could go from Israel to Jordan. Or you could go from Israel to Egypt because they've made peace. So when we say that countries have made peace, there are really practical ramifications to that in addition to just the global politics of it. I think I'm going to pause because I want to give at least some time for some Q&A before I wrap up with, next steps. I see some comments in the chat. The role of Reform Judaism in Israel, very complex. It's related to what I said about kind of religiosity and who controls religious decisions. In Israel, when the state was founded, a lot of the people who came to Israel who wanted to see the state be built were very secular. They did not see themselves as religious Jews at all, and they didn't really care about the more religious elements of Judaism. And so some of the people who came that were more religious, that were Orthodox, who cared very much about religious practice, a deal was struck at the time of the establishment of the State of Israel that the Orthodox people would get on board with establishing the state as long as they could control all religious decisions. So the State of Israel has what's called the Rabbanut. They have religious authorities who make religious decisions. They're in control of anything that would be considered religious, which mostly has to do with personal status. So, for example, marriage and divorce and burial, funerals, conversion, things like that are controlled by what's called the Rabbanut, which are Orthodox, and they did not recognize liberal branches of Judaism. They do not recognize liberal branches of Judaism. There has been some progress made in starting to accept some things that Reform Jews do or want to do, but that's also been a complicated piece of the Israel story. Adam shared about plenty of high-paid tech workers. So tech is obviously a huge part of it, or well, maybe not obviously. For those that don't know, there's a big tech industry in Israel. There's a lot of overlap between Silicon Valley and Tel Aviv and companies that operate in both places. So there are some high-paid workers. There are some very highly paid people, but it's not a majority. It's a small percentage, and there's definitely major economic challenges in the country. There's a question, did the people in Gaza want Egyptian citizenship? Did the people in the West Bank want Jordanian citizenship? It's a great question that I don't totally know the answer to. I think what the people of this land who are Arab want is statehood. They want a state. They want a Palestinian state, a state of Palestine. They want their own state, their own citizenship. So I don't think that they wanted Egyptian or Jordanian citizenship. But the problem is, even if they wanted it, I don't think it was offered. And it leads to this problem of having no citizenship anywhere. So even to this day, Palestinians are considered stateless. They do not have passports. They can't travel. They don't have the ability to go anywhere because they are not considered part of a state. And they definitely do not want Israeli citizenship. So that makes things even more complicated, is this issue of statehood and citizenship. Scott asked, would we do an Israel 102 at some point? Well, what I'm going to direct you to is a lot of other Israel learning that we do, because to some degree, when you've had a little bit of the just baseline, all the other learning we do is relevant. Like, you can kind of build on this. So maybe I can do a 102, but it's almost like when we get to 102, it has to differentiate. Are we talking more about this issue or that issue? Because there's so many different issues. But a lot of that we do offer at Temple Isaiah. We have a really, really vibrant Israel and World Jewry committee that plans lots and lots of Israel programs and lectures. We also are about to start a series for people to discuss Israel in small groups. So it's a small groups initiative. Karen, who's on our call today, is helping to launch it along with Susan Mountner. And the idea of that is it's going to be a 6 week, I think it's 6 weeks, a 6 week kind of thing that you sign up for, group, and you're in a small group of people, about 12 people. It will be facilitated by one member of the group, and it is set up as a 6 week kind of almost a course of focusing on different aspects about Israel, but in a more discussion based way, to kind of grapple with some of these challenging aspects around Israel. But to think about, what does Israel mean to us, and how do we relate to Israel as a state, as a land, as a history. So it's a more personal approach, but getting at it through different lenses. So that's why it's 6 weeks, and it's done in a small group to create some sense of camaraderie and sort of safety in that group, to be able to express our feelings and our concerns and thoughts. So if you want to get a little more into this, I would definitely recommend signing up for one of those groups. It's going to be starting in October after the high holidays. So kind of be on the lookout for the publicity from Isaiah. That's a great kind of, in a way, a 102, because you're going to get more into some of these topics. But it's less frontal. Today was very frontal. I'm just trying to share a lot of information. That's more discussion based. Um, we have a few minutes left. Are there
This is
other
this is
questions?
Jack.
Yeah,
This is
Jack.
Jack. Maybe some of you have seen it, but CNN is having this series called Jerusalem, City of Faith and Fury. Like, it's
Mhm.
really, really good, and it's
Yeah,
continuing. And if you've
I
missed them,
heard great
I
things
think you
about
can
it.
go on CNN and watch the other episodes that have been aired. But it's really very interesting and I think very educational.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. Yes, it's I've also heard very good things about that series. The challenge, one of the many challenges with Israel is that there are a lot of competing narratives. You know, how do we tell the story about Israel, how it began, how it developed, how it changed, how the maps have changed? I did my best to try to be as factual as possible, but even I come at it through a certain lens. And if you heard this talk given by a Palestinian person, they might share the story differently. So whenever we're reading articles or hearing things about Israel, a really important question to consider is what's the source? Where is it coming from? What's the perspective? There was a meme, I think meme is the right word. There was a thing being sent around when the crisis in Gaza was happening, which was showing Israel in maps over time. And it basically was showing how Israel just keeps taking over the world, basically, and is kicking everybody else out. But it had no nuance and didn't give any context for what what it was trying to show. And it was a very inflammatory kind of series of maps. And I remember thinking, like, you have to see what the source is. And that source was definitely coming from a Palestinian perspective of viewing Israel as like the interlopers, you know, who just came and took over and don't belong here, which is a very different perspective than, you know, we have as Jews about we do belong there. That doesn't mean Palestinians don't belong there either. But we do belong there, and there should be a Jewish state. And it's just a question of how do we have both? Um, let's see, there's some other questions coming up in the chat. I know a few people are leaving, no problem. Do American Reform Jews generally believe in a Palestinian state? So the word believe is tricky. I would say argue for or want. Yes, I would say most American Reform Jews would advocate for a two-state solution, meaning having a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. And I will share in a moment a resource for that. Specific books you would recommend. Exodus, yes. So Alan is sharing Exodus is a novel. Beirut to Jerusalem is a great novel. There are a lot of good books. I'm trying to think of what I would recommend as like a next step. Um, I think I don't have anything off the top of my head, but I am going to send out a follow-up email to everyone who signed up for this course with a series of classes or talks that we've given through Isaiah on Israel in the last 6 months or so. And in that, I can try to share some readings that I would recommend, some books or other readings. Also, the beginning of the talk was not recorded. I'm sorry. I don't know that I'm going to do this talk again. I'm happy to talk individually to people. The beginning, really, I was just trying to give some biblical context to the idea that Jews have a long history with this land. And I talked a little bit about King David and the beginnings of the temple, which I can try to do again another time, but I'm not sure. So we're almost at 1 o'clock. I will follow up with some other talks that I would recommend listening to and some ways of connecting. Again, this 6-week series we're doing on Israel coming up would definitely be something recommended if you want to get a little bit more into this topic. And I just want to thank all of you so much for being here. I did mention there are some organizations that do really great work around Israel and Israel advocacy. One is called the Israel Policy Forum. I'm putting that in the chat. We had the executive director of the Israel Policy Forum give a talk a few weeks ago, which I will send you. But that's an organization whose entire mission is to advocate and do programming around trying to get to a two-state solution. So that's a great organization. Another really good organization is called the New Israel Fund. They support lots of social justice work in Israel to try to make Israel itself a more just place. So that's another organization to look into. So thank you, everyone. And I will look forward to continuing to learn with you all in the future. And wishing you all Shana Tova. Happy New Year.
Thank you,
Thank,
Rabbi.
thank you, Rabbi. Excellent
You're
job.
very
Thank you.
welcome.
Bye.
I'm going to stop.